The soup spoon stopped halfway to her mouth because the laugh was already out of her, low and helpless, and there was no calling it back into the silence of that long, candlelit table. 23 people sat between the two ends of it, and not one of them had made a sound in 4 full minutes. She had counted the minutes the way she counted everything, by habit, by the small private arithmetic that kept her steady in rooms where she did not belong. The laugh had come from nothing anyone else could see. The footman behind the Countess had, with the gravest possible dignity, set down a dish of glazed pears and then, in the act of straightening, caught the hem of his own coat on the carved finial of the chair, so that for one suspended instant, the most solemn man in the room stood half-bent and bound to a piece of furniture, frozen in an attitude of accidental devotion. No one else had been looking. She had. And so the laugh. Every head turned. She felt the turning the way you feel a draft find the back of your neck. All those faces swinging toward her with the slow synchrony of weather vanes in a changing wind. And she understood in the space of a breath that she had a few seconds to decide what kind of woman she would be for the rest of this evening, and possibly the rest of her life. She could lower her eyes. She could press her napkin to her lips and murmur an apology, and let them fold her back into the wallpaper, where guests of her uncertain standing were expected to remain. That was the sensible course. That was the course her aunt had spent 11 days on the long carriage journey drilling into her like a catechism. Be small, Margaret had said. Be grateful and be small. And perhaps no one will ask whose daughter you are. She was not even certain anymore whose daughter she was, in the way these people meant it. Her father had been a man of books and debts in equal measure. And the books had outlasted him, and the debts had outlasted her, and that was the whole of her inheritance. But she did not lower her eyes. She sat with the laugh still warm in her throat, and she looked back at them, every one of them, and she was the only person at that table who did not look sorry. She had decided in those few seconds that being sorry for noticing the truth was a thing she had done quite enough of. It was then that she saw him. He sat at the head of the table where the candlelight gathered thickest, and he had not turned with the others. He had been looking at her already, before the laugh, perhaps, or in the instant of it. His face arranged into an expression so still it was not an expression at all, but the absence of one. They had told her about him in whispers all week, the way one is told about weather that has killed people. The Duke does not dance. The Duke does not jest. The Duke buried 2 wives and a brother and has not been heard to laugh since the second funeral. They did not say his name without lowering their voices, as though the name itself might overhear and take offense. And now the name was looking at her, down the length of 23 silent guests, and she could not read a single thing in his face. And that, she would think later, was the moment everything began. Though it did not feel like a beginning. It felt like being seen through. She held his gaze longer than was wise. She was aware of being unwise even as she did it. Aware of her aunt 3 places down, going the particular gray of a woman watching her one remaining asset commit ruin over a dish of pears. But there was something in the stillness of him that did not ask her to look away. Most powerful men, she had observed, used their attention the way a careless hand uses a candle, swinging it about, setting small fires, expecting the world to flinch from the flame. His attention did not move. It simply rested on her, complete and unhurried, and beneath it she felt not scorched but, strangely, weighed, as a coin is weighed by someone who has been cheated before and means not to be again. Then the moment broke, because such moments always do, broken here by the Countess, who recovered her social footing with the speed of long practice, and observed, into the room at large, that the young ladies of the present generation found amusement in a great many things their grandmothers had found alarming. A small ripple of relieved laughter went round, the safe and joyless laughter of people grateful to be told the awkwardness was over. Margaret seized it and turned it into an apology, leaning toward the Countess, murmuring that her niece had traveled far and was unused to such fine company, that the journey had left her overtired, that it would not happen again. Margaret was very good at this. Margaret had spent her own youth being small and grateful, and had a widow's modest competence to show for it, and a perpetual fear behind her eyes that it might still all be taken back. The young woman, whose name was Cecily, and who had not been asked, said nothing in her own defense. She had learned that defending oneself before these people only gave them the pleasure of pretending to be persuaded. Instead, she returned to her soup, which had gone cool, and she ate it with the same care she did everything, and she did not look again toward the head of the table, though she felt the absence of his looking, and was surprised to find she missed it, as one misses a fire when one moves to the cold side of the room. What no one at that table knew, what her aunt had sworn her to conceal on pain of being sent back to the 2 damp rooms they could barely afford, was the matter of the ledgers. For 3 years since her father's death, Cecily had kept the books for a wine merchant in the town nearest their lodging, a Mr. Harrow, who could read figures only with his lips moving and his finger dragging beneath the line. She did it in secret, by candlelight. The work passed to her through a servant's back door, and the coins came back the same way. And it was this, and not her aunt's competence, that had kept them in bread through 2 hard winters. She had a head for numbers that her father had once called unwomanly, and then, when the debts began, had called a mercy. She could hold a column of figures in her mind the way other women held a tune. She could find the single false entry in a year of honest ones, the way a tongue finds the one cracked tooth. It was the only thing she truly knew herself to be good at. And it was the one thing in all the world she was forbidden to be seen doing. Because a lady did not keep books, and a woman who kept books was not a lady. And a woman who was not a lady had no business at a duke's table pretending to be one. So she sat and was pretended into ladyhood for the length of a dinner, and she ate her cool soup, and across the gulf of the table, the most feared man in 3 counties did not stop for the rest of that long and ceremonious evening, considering the face of the only person present who had not looked sorry. The dinner ended as such dinners end, by exhaustion rather than design. The dishes carried out in a procession, the company rising in their order of precedence, the great room emptying by degrees into smaller rooms, where the men would have their wine and the women their careful conversation. Cecily found herself swept into a parlor, hung with portraits of people who had all, by the look of them, died disappointed. Her aunt's hand closed on her arm the instant they were through the door, the grip of a woman who had been waiting all evening to deliver a sentence and had honed it to a point. "You laughed," Margaret said, very low, smiling all the while toward the room, so that any observer would have read tenderness in the bend of her head. "You laughed at the Duke's own table, at the Duke's own footman, and you held his eye like a tavern girl, and I have spent everything I have. Do you understand me? Everything. To put you in this house for 3 nights, and you have ruined it in the soup." "I am sorry it troubles you," Cecily said, which was true and was also not an apology, and Margaret heard the difference, as she heard most things. "You will be sorry it troubles you when we are turned out of even those 2 rooms," her aunt said. "Do you imagine he did not notice? A man like that notices everything and forgives nothing. They say he keeps a list. They say he has never once been made to look a fool without repaying it. And you have made his table laugh at his expense." "I made no one laugh," Cecily said. "I laughed. There is a difference, and he, I think, is a man who knows it." She did not know why she said the last part. She had no evidence for it beyond the stillness of a face at 30 feet. But she found she believed it, and she found that believing it steadied her. and she let her aunt's grip and her aunt's fear flow past her like cold water past a stone in a stream. She had been a stone in cold water for 3 years. She had grown rather good at it. It was perhaps an hour later, when the candles had burned down to a softer light and the company had thinned to those too proud to leave early and too tired to talk, that a servant in the dark livery of the house crossed the parlor and stopped before her aunt and bowed, and said that his grace requested the company of the younger lady in the library, and that the elder lady was most welcome to wait. Margaret's face performed 3 separate emotions in quick succession: terror and calculation and a desperate flowering hope, and she gripped Cecily's arm once more and breathed instructions too fast to follow. And Cecily, rising, heard almost none of them. She heard only the word library, and felt, beneath all her steadiness, the first true quickening of the night. Because a man who meant to humiliate a girl did it in a parlor full of witnesses, and a man who summoned her alone to a room full of books meant something else entirely. And she did not know what, and not knowing it, she walked toward it. The library, when the servant opened its door and bowed her through, and closed it again behind her, was the warmest room she had entered in that cold and ceremonious house. A fire burned low and steady in a great hearth. Books stood floor to ceiling on 3 walls, more books than she had seen since her father's were sold, and the sight of them caught at something under her ribs that she had thought safely buried. And before the fire, in a chair turned half toward the door as though he had been waiting, and wished her to know he had been waiting, sat the Duke, with a small table beside him, and on the table, open, a ledger. She saw the ledger before she saw his face. She would remember that after. Her eye went to it the way a thirsty creature's goes to water, and she understood, in the cold, clear instant of recognizing it, that she had been brought here for a reason she could not yet name, and that the laugh in the soup had been only the door, and this the room behind the door. "You did not look sorry," he said. It was the first thing he said. His voice was lower than she had imagined and entirely without heat, a voice that stated things rather than performed them. "I have watched a great many people be sorry at that table. You were the first in some years who was not." "There was nothing to be sorry for," she answered. A man caught his coat on a chair. It was funny. I laughed. I would think less of myself if I had pretended I did not see what I saw. "And what did you see?" he said, that no one else at that table appeared to see. She understood the question was not about the footman. She did not yet know what it was about, but she understood it was a test of some kind, and she had taken many tests, alone, by candlelight, with her livelihood hanging on the answer. And she had learned not to flinch at the moment of being weighed. "The truth," she said. "People are very busy not seeing it. It makes them poor company and worse witnesses. I have found it costs less in the end to see things as they are." For a long moment he said nothing. The fire spoke instead, settling in the grate, and somewhere in the house a clock counted off a quarter hour in 9 slow strokes. She found herself counting without meaning to. Then he turned the open ledger a half turn on the little table so that the lamplight fell across the columns, and he said, in the same flat, unhurried voice, "Then perhaps you will tell me what you see here, because I have had 4 clever men look at these pages and swear to me they were honest, and I do not believe them, and I cannot prove why." She crossed the room. She knew she should not. She knew a lady did not bend over a strange man's accounts in a firelit room at night, that her aunt's whole campaign and their 2 damp rooms and the bread of next winter all stood between her and that ledger. And she crossed the room anyway, because the pull of an honest column toward an honest reading was older in her than fear, and because some reckless and long-starved part of her had decided that if she was to be ruined for laughing, she might as well be ruined for the truth entire. She bent over the page. She did not touch it. She read the way she had taught herself to read, not the numbers first, but the shape of them, the rhythm. The places where an honest hand grows tired and an honest sum grows ragged. And she found, almost at once, the thing that was wrong because it was too smooth. Honest accounts breathe. These did not breathe. These had been written to be looked at, not to be true. This entry, she said, and here, and here. She moved her finger above the page without touching it, naming 3 lines. They are too round. A working account is full of awkward sums, the pennies and halfpennies of real things bought from real men on real days. These are clean. Someone has built you a house with no dust in it, and a house with no dust, Your Grace, is a house no one has ever lived in. These figures were not kept. They were composed, after the fact, by a man who knew you would only look at the totals and never at the breadth between them. She straightened. She had said too much. She always said too much, the moment numbers were before her. It was the one subject on which her famous composure broke, and it had broken now, in the worst possible room, before the worst possible man. And she watched his still face for the verdict and prepared herself to be sorry after all. He did not look at her with anger. He looked at her with something she had no name for, because no one had ever turned it on her before. And it took her a moment to understand it was attention of a wholly different order than the kind she had met across the table. That had been weighing. This was recognition. He looked at her the way she imagined she must look at a false ledger, finding in it at last the thing he had known was there and could not see, and the seeing changing everything that came after. "Sit down," he said. And then, after a pause in which he seemed to weigh even the courtesy, "Please." She sat. The fire warmed one side of her face. He closed the ledger but kept his hand upon it, and he told her, in that flat, unhurried voice that she was beginning to understand spent nothing it did not mean, that the accounts were his steward's, that the man had served the house 30 years, that 3 of those 4 clever men had been the steward's own choosing, and the 4th a friend of the steward's wife, and that for 2 years the Duke had felt the certainty of being robbed, the way one feels a draft in a sealed room, and had been unable to find the gap. He told her that he had not summoned her for the ledger at all. He had summoned her because she had laughed, and because a person who would laugh at the truth in a room that punished it was, in his experience, the rarest creature alive, and he had thought, watching her down the length of his joyless table, that such a person might be the only one in 3 counties he could trust to look at his accounts and tell him a thing he did not wish to hear. "I did not expect," he said, "that you would find it in under a minute." The 4 clever men took a fortnight each. The 4 clever men, she said, were paid by the fortnight. I was paid in being believed. It is a faster currency. And at that, at last, the most feared man in 3 counties did a thing the servants would not have credited had they seen it, a thing his own household had not witnessed in longer than they could reckon. The corner of his mouth moved. It was not a laugh. It was the distant relation of a laugh, the ghost of one, the place where a laugh would stand if the man still kept them. But she saw it, because she saw everything, and she understood that she had found, in his face, the same thing she had found in his ledger, the breath between the figures, the small, awkward true sum that proved a living thing was there, beneath the composed and dust-free surface. He was not a house no one had lived in. He was only a house that had been shut up a long time, against the cold, against the grief, against the long parade of people who had wanted things from him and called it devotion. They talked then, longer than either of them had intended, the fire burning lower and the clock counting its quarter hours unheeded. He asked her where she had learned to read accounts, and she told him the truth, all of it, the wine merchant and the back door and the coins and the bread, because she had already ruined herself for the truth that night and saw no reason to stop. and because there was something in the way he listened, without flinching and without pity, that made the telling feel less like confession than like setting down a weight. He did not recoil at the word merchant. He did not recoil at the word secret. He listened the way he had looked at her, completely. And when she had finished, he was quiet for a while. And then he said only that it seemed to him a great waste that a mind which could find in a minute what 4 men missed in a season should be hidden behind a servant's door and spent on another man's wine. "It is not waste," she said. "It is bread." The two are often confused by people who have always had the second. He inclined his head at that, conceding it, and she saw that he was a man who could be corrected, which she had not known was a thing dukes could be, and the discovery rearranged something in her understanding of the world. They had told her he forgave nothing. They had not told her he could yield a point to a poor woman in a firelit room and seem, in the yielding, more himself rather than less. When at last the same dark liveried servant came to say that the hour was very late and the elder lady grown anxious, the Duke rose and Cecily rose, and for a moment they stood on either side of the little table with the closed ledger between them, like a thing they had agreed upon without naming it. He said that he would have a proposal for her aunt in the morning, an honest one, that need shame no one, regarding the keeping of his accounts, that he had no further use for stewards he could not believe, and no intention of being robbed for a 3rd year out of mere regard for a long service that had curdled into theft. He said it plainly, as a matter of business, but his eyes, when he said it, were not the eyes of a man speaking only business, and she, who could find the false entry in a year of honest ones, did not miss the one true sum in all his careful columns. She did not sleep that night. She lay in the narrow guest bed with the fire reflected still behind her eyes and the ledger's clean, false lines still scrolling in her mind. And beneath them, steadier, the memory of a still face learning, against its long habit, to be surprised. Her aunt, when Cecily returned to the parlor, had gone white, and then red, and then had said a great many things very fast, and Cecily had told her only that the Duke wished to speak with her in the morning, about a matter of employment. And Margaret had heard the word employment and gone white again, because in her world, a lady did not take employment, and a woman who took employment confessed thereby to not being a lady, and the whole fragile fiction of their 3 nights would collapse the instant it was spoken aloud in that house. But it was already too late for the fiction, and Cecily found she did not mourn it. She had been small and grateful for 3 years, and it had bought her 2 damp rooms and a perpetual fear. She was curious, lying awake, what the truth might buy instead. The morning's interview she was not permitted to attend. It was conducted between the Duke and her aunt alone, in the same library, and it lasted the better part of an hour, and Cecily spent that hour walking the cold gravel paths of the garden, with her hands folded and her heart performing arithmetic it had no business attempting. When Margaret emerged, she was a woman transformed, and Cecily, reading her face the way she read everything, could not at first parse the figures of it, for there was triumph in it and fear in it, and beneath both a kind of grief that puzzled her until, walking back toward the carriage, her aunt told her in a rush of low, fierce words what had been agreed. The Duke would retain her, Cecily, to set his accounts in order and to keep them after. She would be lodged in the house, properly, with a maid and a room of her own, and a wage that made the wine merchant's coins look like the small change they were. And Margaret would be settled too, given a cottage on the estate and a modest pension, so that her long campaign of smallness might at last be laid down. It was everything Margaret had crossed the country to win, and she had won it, and the winning had broken something in her, because she had meant to win it the old way, by marriage and silence and the careful hiding of all that Cecily was, and instead it had been won by the one thing she had spent 11 days in a carriage forbidding, the truth, laughed aloud at the wrong moment before the wrong man, who had turned out to be the right one. "You will be talked of," Margaret said, and there was no triumph in it now, only the old fear worn down to something almost like love. A woman who keeps a duke's books and lodges in his house. They will say things, Cecily. They will say the worst things. Let them, Cecily said. They will say I see what others do not. They will not be wrong. And so she did not go home to the 2 damp rooms. She stayed. The household, which had heard everything, watched her with the wary fascination one gives to a creature whose category is uncertain, neither guest, nor servant, nor mistress. A woman who sat in the library by day with the ledger spread before her, and rose, sometimes, to find the Duke standing in the doorway, having come in quietly to watch her work as one watches whether one has learned to trust. The steward of 30 years was dismissed within the fortnight, and not gently. She found, in the end, 11 false entries spread across 2 years, a slow, patient theft dressed in the costume of devotion, and she laid them before the Duke one gray afternoon, line by line, the breath between the figures made visible at last. The Duke read them through twice, and then sat for a long while with his hand over his mouth. Not in distress at the money, she understood, but at the 30 years, at the long, warm lie of a service he had believed in, and she did the only thing she knew how to do, which was to stay in the room with him while it settled, and to let the silence hold, and not to fill it. The winter came, and the house that had been shut up against the cold a long time began, by small degrees, to open. It was not sudden, and it was not declared. That was not the manner of either of them. It happened in the way a fire is built, one piece at a time, with patience, with attention, with the willingness to wait for the catch. He took to bringing her books from the shelves she eyed, leaving them by her ledgers without comment, and she took to leaving in their margins small, dry observations he would find later and, finding, keep. They argued about figures and discovered they argued well, neither giving ground that truth did not require. She made him laugh, once, truly, in the 3rd week of December, at a thing she said about the late steward's accounting being the only place the man had ever shown imagination, and the sound of it startled them both, rusty and unpracticed and entirely real. And afterward, they sat in a different kind of silence, the kind that is not absence, but presence, the kind that does not need filling, because nothing in it is missing. She thought, sometimes, of the soup, of the spoon halfway to her mouth, and the laugh already out of her, and the whole length of the silent table turning, and of how the sensible course had been to lower her eyes, and of how the entire course of her life had hinged on the few seconds in which she had decided not to be sorry. She had spent 3 years being small, and it had bought her fear. She had spent 1 moment being seen, and it had bought her a fire to sit beside, and a mind across from her that met her own, and a man who, having forgotten how to laugh, had remembered it in her company. She did not call it love yet, even to herself, for she was not a woman who composed her accounts before the figures were in. But she kept the column honestly, day by day, and she watched the totals grow, and she found in them, at the bottom of all the careful breathing sums, the one true entry she had been waiting her whole guarded life to find, and it was this, that she had been right not to look sorry, and that being seen, truly seen, by one steady, unflinching pair of eyes was worth more than all the safe lowered glances in the world. By the turn of the year, when the snow lay clean and deep over the estate, and the garden paths she had once walked counting her own heartbeats, the matter resolved itself the way such matters do between 2 people too honest to perform what they do not feel, and too patient to rush what they do. He came to her in the library on the last gray afternoon of the old year, and he did not make a speech, for he was not a man of speeches, and she would not have believed one if he had. He set a thing on the table beside her ledger, a small thing, a key, the key to the library itself, and he said only that the room had been the warmest in the house for a long time, and the loneliest, and that he found he no longer wished it to be the second of those, and that she might keep the key, and the room, and him, if she found the figures favorable. And Cecily, who could find the one false entry in a year of honest ones, looked at the account he had laid before her and found in it no falseness anywhere, only the plainest and truest sum she had ever been given. And she closed the ledger, and she gave her answer in the manner he would best believe, which was not in words at all, but in staying, in the simple, decisive act of not rising to leave, of letting the silence hold and choosing, this once, to be the one who filled it. It broke quietly, the thing between them, the way the best things do, not with trumpets, but with the small, soft click of a closing book, and a fire built up against the dark, and two people who had each spent a long time being unseen, finally, at last, in the warm, dustful breathing truth of an ordinary room, seeing and being seen. As for the others, the news of them came in time, relayed by the long, slow post of country gossip, each fate arriving like a small parcel late in the winter. The steward of 30 years was not prosecuted, the dupe judging that the man's own face, on being dismissed, had cost him more than any court could, and he removed to a distant town where, it was said, he set up as an advisor on matters of accounting, and was, by all reports, scrupulously honest, having at last met someone who could see through him, and finding the experience instructive. The Countess, who had observed so wisely upon the alarming amusements of the present generation, was heard to remark, when the engagement was known, that she had always thought the girl had something about her which surprised everyone who had heard her say, that same evening, very nearly the opposite. The 4 clever men who had pronounced the ledgers honest were not heard from again, the matter being, by mutual and unspoken agreement, allowed to drop, and the footman, the unwitting author of the whole affair, who had caught his coat upon the chair and bound himself in accidental devotion before the most solemn company in 3 counties, was promoted within the year to the charge of the wine cellar, where his gravity at last found its proper home, and where he was known, ever after, to set down each bottle with the greatest possible care, having learned, perhaps better than anyone, the strange and lasting consequences of a single small misstep observed by the right pair of eyes. And so the fire burns low, and the story comes to its rest, and I find I am loath to leave it, the way one is always a little loath to leave a warm room for the cold hall beyond. If you have ever sat silent in a place that asks you to be smaller than you are, swallowing the laugh, lowering the eyes, being grateful and being quiet and being unseen, then you know the weight Cecily carried to that table. And you know, too, the strange terror and the stranger freedom of the moment she set it down. We spend so much of our lives being sorry for the things we notice, apologizing for seeing clearly in rooms that would rather we did not. But sometimes, the laugh that escapes at the wrong moment is the truest thing we will ever say. And sometimes, the one person who matters is the one who does not turn away when we refuse to be sorry. Tell me, before the embers go dark, which moment stayed with you? The spoon halfway to her mouth, or the closed ledger and the key set down beside it? Tell me which line you carried with you out of the firelight. And if this story warmed you, even a little, draw your chair a touch closer and stay a while longer, for there is always another tale waiting in the coals, another quiet life about to be seen at last, and I would be glad of your company by the fire when I tell it. Rest easy now, and sleep gentle, and I will keep the fire burning until you come again.